Everyone for joining us here this morning. I'm pleased to be joined by the Electricity Authority Chief Executive Sarah Gillies and Independent Chair of the Review Sarah Sinclair to present this report to you today. On the 26th of June, I released terms of reference of the Electricity Authority's investigation into the Northland transmission tower collapse that occurred on the 20th of June. That report has now been finalised and is being released today. The tower collapse event caused immediate disruption and left 88,000 Northland residents and businesses without power. The economic consequences were vast, businesses were unable to operate, and households faced disruption to their day-to-day lives. Following the event, it became very clear that this was caused because of the removal of the nuts of the tower from its base plates. The report shows a range of estimates of this failure causing economic impact between $37.5 million and $80 million in lost economic activity, and that without distributed electricity generation, this figure would have been even higher. The report details an over-reliance by Transpower on service providers to ensure that critical assets are maintained, and it also found that identifiable risks were missed, including concerns that were raised internally by Transpower staff. It also recounts how concerns were raised by a senior engineer within Transpower in 2021 regarding a gap in the knowledge of maintenance crews undertaking foundation work, but that the recommendations for improvement by Transpower were not acted on. And there is evidence that this was not a one-off occasion. Transpower's failure to act on these opportunities and recommendations from engineers within its business has led to these terrible consequences for the people of Northland. The Northland region was fortunate, though, to have a significant amount of distributed generation. This enabled many customers to get up and running following the tower collapse, and for that to happen quickly. The government has already announced that we will be easing the restrictions that currently exist on electricity distribution businesses so they can increase electricity generation and bolster regional resilience, and details will be confirmed by Cabinet later this year. In total, the Electricity Authority report makes 26 recommendations. These include Transpower improving processes for maintenance work for base plate refurbishment and ensuring its contractors are more appropriately trained, monitored and compliant. Transpower should require its service providers to review and revise their work procedures for base plate refurbishment to ensure they align with Transpower's technical specifications. And Transpower ensuring regular reporting and escalation of non-compliance by service providers to the Transpower's board so that the board and senior management can exercise effective governance and oversight. The Electricity Authority also developing options to amend the Electricity Code to allow for more regional resilience through distributed energy able to generate more on their own networks. I will be writing to the Electricity Authority to express my expectation that the recommendations are implemented and that they work with Transpower on the implementation of the recommendations that are relevant to them. The Electricity Authority will also be monitoring those recommendations. Finally, I wish to thank the Electricity Authority and in particular the Review's Independent Chair Sarah Sinclair for this comprehensive report. Overall, it shows a significant impact on the people of Northland, and ultimately the failures have been socialised and the costs have been paid for by the people of Northland, which is incredibly concerning for them. But now we have to learn from it and implement these reforms to ensure that this doesn't happen again. I'm now going to pass over to Sarah Sinclair as the Independent Reviewer to make a few comments, and then we'll take questions.
Kia ora tātou. I think the Minister has covered very well the key findings and the recommendations of the report. What I would like to emphasise is that the consequences of this event were borne by communities, and that's the thing that the Electricity Authority and the team has kept absolutely front of mind when looking at a system level, what went wrong and where are the gaps and what are the lessons learned. So there are a series of key findings that focus on the critical nature of this infrastructure, and with such critical infrastructure comes a heightened responsibility for assurance and oversight. There are a range of recommendations that go to specifically this type of maintenance work, but also some system-wide recommendations around how these things can be done better across the whole country for all of our communities. It also highlights the real opportunity around regional resilience. and making for every region of New Zealand a more resilient electricity system. It's been an absolute pleasure to chair this with a fantastic team at the Electricity Authority, so thank you very much.
You've said this is not a one-off. How many times did it happen?
Do you want to? I think there are. Reading the report, I don't think that the report clarifies that number exactly. But I think what it identifies is that the procedures which this contractor were utilising was something that had been done before, and I can get Sarah to speak to the recommendation. But effectively, that is why there's a recommendation that there needs to also be not just before and after photos of the maintenance work, but also during photos to provide greater assurances. But I'll ask Sarah to speak further to that, or Sarah.
Look, I don't have too much to add to that, but I think it's important to think about, consistency across practices across service providers and across regions, and ultimately about the assurance that happens across that.
So we have no idea how many times that someone has removed enough nuts for a tower to fall over before.
I don't have a specific on the specific circumstances, but it's about the overall kind of processes, procedures that are used, and the assurance that goes across those.
Do you know how widespread that practice was?
We understand that practices weren't consistent across the country, but we don't have a data set, and I think this goes exactly to the recommendations. We don't have a data set of what happens on every single work order or job, and so the point of this specific recommendation and set of recommendations is to make sure with critical assets there is heightened practical solutions around making sure that assurance is put in place and actually given effect to. So we don't have the data set, but you can see that's at the very heart of the recommendation.
So we're probably lucky that this is the first time that it's happened, given what we know.
There's certainly room for improvement.
Can you elaborate on exactly what concerns were raised in 2021 and would acting on those have prevented what happened this year?
I might pass to Sarah on that. Because
So my understanding is, and it's set out in the report, but my understanding is there was I believe a senior engineer who raised a concern about specifics in terms of training and how that could possibly be improved that wasn't picked up.
Do you know what was sort of going through the minds of the contractors when they did this? Exactly sort of why they did this? Was this a sort of time-saving thing to remove more bolts, or did they simply have no idea that they should be doing that? Did they forget, for some reason they're taking the bolts off? When I assume you've spoken to them, what were they thinking when they did this?
So, I don't know if you want to talk to that.
I think this one goes to what the report's been very careful to talk about system. What system allows this to happen? And a system that lacks training and supervision allows this to happen. So we think that is the cause. The underlying cause of some probably young person going out taking off a whole lot of nuts is actually a system question, a system that allows that process to take place.
But you asked them presumably, why did you do this? What was their response?
We've also got some recommendations in the report around information and our ability to gather information. So we had as much information as we were able to get, but some was still subject to privilege. So a lot of questions were asked, but I think that the answers were sufficient for us to make findings around the system and processes.
Did you actually ask them why they did this?
Yes.
What did they say?
We got a series of responses, but some were subject to legal privilege, and we couldn't get all of it.
So you can't discuss it?
No, I don't.
Will there be consequences for the contracting company or the contractors who were involved in this case?
It's a matter for Transpower.
That's a matter for Transpower.
What about for Transpower? I mean, look at all of the businesses that lost money here. They were warned about the situation, they never acted on it, and ultimately it ended up that, as you mentioned, the community felt the impact of that. Should there be some kind of financial consequence for Transpower?
I think at this stage, today is about the releasing of this report and about the recommendations which have been outlined. I'll be obviously discussing this report with my colleague, who's the Minister of State-Owned Enterprises, Honourable Paul Goldsmith. But look, there's a range of recommendations which are about the future and how we can ensure this doesn't happen again. And it's not a question for me in terms of that's a question for the authority, but in terms of accountability, I'll be certainly talking. This report will be discussed between myself and Minister Goldsmith as well.
Just looking at 8.26 here, the grid skills training. The foundation course doesn't provide clear guidance on the number of nuts to be removed at one time, the number of tower legs to be removed at one time, and the risks to tower stability. Isn't that the basics?
I would say absolutely, and I think this is why this report, it's why, as the Minister, I requested this report to take place. I went up to the site the day after the tower fell over. It was very clear what the reason, and the fact that they'd removed too many bolts and nuts from the base plates, and the basics were not done. And you know, for critical infrastructure, which New Zealand businesses and consumers rely on, we have far greater expectations than what we've seen here. Now, so this is why the report was issued. It has now come back with a number of recommendations, 26 recommendations. Most of them are focused very much on the basics, and it's our expectation that Transpower take this on board and give effect to them, and the Electricity Authority will be monitoring that on a regular basis and reporting to me to ensure that happens.
So I know you're going to, I know you're going to have a conversation with Minister Goldsmith, and that's, you know, it's his responsibility there as far as the enterprise goes, but I think a question that you should be able to answer is whether you think that the level of these recommendations are the end of the road as far as the accountability that Transpower should stand up for, right? I mean, we have here pretty gross incompetence as far as doing their job, listening to the concerns and what's expected of them. So do you think that the recommendations as they stand now are the end of the road as far as what Transpower needs to do to make up for what it did?
Well, I think what the question here is around what they need to do to change, and my expectation is that they give effect to all of those changes. But clearly, there is a need for them to actually listen when concerns are being raised by senior engineers within their business, that those lessons or those concerns are being given effect to, rather than being ignored. And that's what has been identified here in this report, and that's not acceptable.
But do you think that affecting all of these recommendations, if they adopt all of them with as much urgency as you like, is that enough for them to
I think,
for what happened?
Well, I'm happy. I mean, I get Sarah to answer it, but I guess at a high level, this is critical infrastructure. They are responsible for other elements of critical infrastructure too. The expectation is they treat critical infrastructure with highest regard, because ultimately New Zealand households and businesses rely upon it and have very high expectations around how they operate.
When this happened, the backup...
I'll let Sam...
Yeah, well, I can speak to the other part of this. So this review is a broader kind of terms of reference to cover the kind of system-wide piece. But it's also important to understand that we have a separate compliance process that applies. And so we're also, the authority is separately investigating an alleged breach of the Electricity Industry Participation Code by Transpower and its role as the grid owner. So that runs through a separate process that's underway at present, but it's kept separate from this. So we'll have more to say about that later.
So is it true that customers in Northland might have discounted power to respond to this?
Oh, I can't speak to that. Unfortunately, I don't.
So you're not aware of that?
No, I mean I don't. So I mean, this one of the things that's actually highlighted in the report around the whole question of compensation is around the communications that Transpower made following the event, which actually caused significant confusion in terms of that particular issue. And I think that's one of the areas they need to do a better job of. I know that they're in conversations with how they can, they have been talking to Northland business associations and are having conversations. I know my colleague Grant McCullum is pushing that issue very strongly, and I understand there's going to be more for them to say in the future, but I can't speak to it at the moment.
What issues do you discount?
No, in terms of basically acknowledgement of the fact that their failure for Northland.
And so can you say you don't know anything about people getting discounted?
Well, I'll ask Sarah Gillies to speak to it, but under the code there's no requirement for compensation. Ultimately, but I'll get Sarah to speak to that in more detail.
And is that a problem though, that there's no requirement for compensation?
Well, I guess that it's a question for Sarah in terms of how the electricity market is set and how it's regulated. But ultimately, the issue here is, I think, identified in the report was around how they communicated that issue and how they caused significant confusion to customers and consumers in Northland, which I think was very unfortunate. Do you want to speak to that issue, Sarah?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I mean, the compliance process does allow for certain orders to be made, but we're not at the end of that process yet. In terms of this report, this was a broader piece. The Minister's already covered the processes that are in place, and Transpower made some comments about where people could go to make inquiries about, insurance and so on. But in terms of our broader compliance powers, there's an element of there are some orders that can be made, but that process hasn't completed yet.
Is that a gap in your power not to be able to order compensation?
There's an independent rulings panel that can make some orders, but whether it's sufficient in these circumstances, I guess, is a question to be considered.
So none of you are aware of power discounts coming through?
No.
Minister, what is your message to Northlanders off the back of this report? Can you assure them that nothing of this nature will ever happen again?
Well, I think what my message to Northlanders is that they've been let down by Transpower. Transpower, if they had listened and taken proper assurance processes, could have prevented this from taking place, and that they have unfortunately paid the cost of them not doing that. But this report has been done because Northland is an incredibly important region. Resilience to that community is incredibly important. We are taking these recommendations seriously, and we are very focused as well around ensuring we can enable more regional distribution of power, which is critically important, not just for Northland, but to ensure that those more remote regions are able to be more resilient in the case of whether it's an instance like this or other events which cause power to be disconnected. They can be more resilient, and that's our focus as a government.
This report still really doesn't explain why these contractors did this. I mean, isn't that absolutely key for learning from the event?
Well, I think
to work out why people did what they did. How can we get all the learnings from what happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll get Sarah if you want to speak to that in terms of.
I think I'll go back to what you said. You asked me this question actually just before, which is how much detail. We can only work on what we've got, and we have worked on that, and that's why we've got a series of findings around the processes and the level of audit and assurance and taking the photos and all of those things that need to be in place. And so, and we're not WorkSafe, we're not those other organisations that each play their own part in the system. So yes, perfect information and full information would be a wonderful thing, but from the information that we've got, we can see that there are gaps in the system and in the processes and in the assurance.
Gaps in the system, but understanding the motivation, why people did what they did, isn't that absolutely fundamental to learning more broadly about how incidents can be prevented?
Yeah.
What was motivating people? Were they trying to save time? Was it something else? Surely that's sort of key to learning, making broad learning about what happened. Accepting that you've identified that there are shortcomings in the systems and processes, yes, but it still doesn't get to the heart of why this happened, does it? If you haven't got information on why those contractors can move to new vaults.
I think the way I'd answer that is I think it has identified there's a range of system problems which led to whether it's the training, whether it's the monitoring, whether it's the assurance by Transpower, whether the appropriate how you do documents were actually made available was all missing, and so there's a range of reasons why this could have happened. And what decisions were made by individuals on the ground. I think I'd make 2 points. Firstly, all of those, that's why the recommendations are incredibly detailed around the system improvements that are needed to actually address quite basic things. So I think that is actually addressing it to ensure that regardless of what decisions are being made on the ground, there are systems and checks and balances in place. The second point I would just make in regards to the contractors, I think it is important to note that the Transpower board needs to, and this is one of the recommendations, needs to actually be asking these questions and making sure that they are at that board level actually having those assurances brought forward and brought up to that level, and they have not been doing that, and they need to be.
So can we just be clear, have the reviewers been able to talk to the 3 tradespeople who were working on the site?
No, we weren't.
Why not?
It's one of your recommendations, isn't it?
Yeah, around the So we asked the questions. We got a series of information from the contractor, but some of it was subject to privilege.
So did you get the information, but you couldn't use it, or they just...
No, we didn't get it.
respond? They didn't respond?
We didn't get it.
I think there's a recommendation in the report to help to address that, and I'll be getting advice from MB around the around this particular issue, which is in regards to the powers that the Electricity Authority have to actually ask for information and receive it.
So I appreciate this is a really well put
Yeah.
together report on systems.
Yeah.
But to Tom's point, if we haven't spoken to the people who did this,
Yeah.
how do we know that it's not going to happen again?
Well, I think that's a question you need to put to Transpower, because ultimately, as the report highlights, the reviewers asked for information. They have raised in this report that there is a need for powers in order to be able to access information if it's being withheld on privileged grounds.
Minister, do you have confidence in the Transpower board?
Well, that's a question that I'd put to Paul Goldsmith. I think, well, it's not a question for me. It's a question for Paul Goldsmith. He is the Minister for State-Owned Enterprises. But what I would say is there are a range of failings which I think can be directly attributed to governance, and that they need to take responsibility for those.
In terms of
One more question.
In terms of that assurance and monitoring that you talked about, Transpower essentially, when this happened, said that contractors had not really been following rules. So does Transpower need more enforcement tools to make sure that it can force these contractors to do what it says and follow the rules?
Well, I think what the report says is that they're contractors, right? They sign contracts with these people. They need to be monitoring those contractors and assuring appropriate assurances going all the way back up to senior management and the board level at Transpower. That is what is missing. They are responsible for the training protocols, they're responsible for the manuals, they're responsible for making sure that regardless of which contractor is, the work's being done in the same way. They're responsible for the assurance processes, and there's a list of recommendations here that Transpower needs to take on board and implement to ensure that this doesn't happen again.
But if the contractor's not following rules...
Well, that's why you need assurance processes in place so that they can hold them to account. And Transpower, as the person paying the bills, or the company paying the bills, ultimately have the tools in order to ensure that they are doing that, and the report recommendations, I think, are very clear that they have not been doing that and they need to be.
How do you say then to Richard Hobbs, owner of Seleni's Ice Cream, who lost $5,000 to $6,000 worth of stock? Transpower are facing no financial penalty for that. That is his entire business, and he is, fighting with insurance while the bosses at Transpower sit there and get a slap on the wrist.
Well, I'd say to him that this is, as I said earlier, this is an incredibly unfortunate situation as to what happened. This is completely unavoidable, and the government has undertaken this review in order to ensure this doesn't happen again. And I would point back to the comments from Sarah at the Gillies from the Electricity Authority that there is a separate process underway in regards to those accountabilities. I bet. Well, I don't have the answer to that question other than I think there's been media commentary on that, and I think the answer to that is that we're very fortunate in this circumstance that everyone was safe, and I think we should be very grateful about that. And that is, I guess, where there are people who are on the front line doing their jobs, but there are also people who are in governance roles and senior leadership roles who need to make sure they're taking accountability to ensure that the job gets done safely and appropriately, and to ensure the reliability of the electricity network.
It's not just a workplace safety thing with someone being close to dying, though. People rely on electricity to stay alive, right?
Last questions, Sarah.
Happy to speak to the. So part of the report looked at the response for medically dependent consumers and the way the processes work with their retailers contacting them, and that all worked smoothly.
So how much does it cost?
How much did the report cost? Look, I think there's a lot of internal time. So we have a team of experts here. We have certainly taken account of how much time we've spent on it, but I couldn't give you a number right now off the top of my head.
Thank you very much. Thank you.